Want to build your career with CMI confidence? Well, it all starts with the tools at your fingertips. CMI creates workplaces full of inspiring leaders with its on-demand resources, network of mentors, and industry-leading accreditations. Search CMI Confidence today.
This session is recorded and will be available on the CMI website and YouTube channel. Join the conversation by using the live chat box for your questions and comments. We'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A.
Good afternoon and welcome along to today's webinar. I'm Matt Roberts, I'm the Director for Chartered Management Consultant here at the CMI. Today we're going to take a detailed look at some of the ethical considerations around AI in what is our third of 3 webinars dedicated to AI. I'm delighted that today joining us as our guest speaker and expert is Dr Tirath Virdee, founder of Xeno AI. Tirath, welcome along and thank you very much in advance for giving us your time today. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Matt, and hello, audience. Look, one of the things I usually say is that the key issue facing us, every individual, every business, is data sovereignty and ethics. We humans are no more than a bunch of neurons connected in a multitude of ways. If you like, we are a set of algorithms doing value exchange based on how we are trained and the environment we find ourselves in. If we lose our data, we lose our souls. And yet, with big tech, with us being virtualized more and more, we are losing that data. Data, I've said in one of my books, is the God particle. It is responsible for the immaculate conception of intelligence, consciousness, intuition, intentionality of our very existence. The advent of deep learning, through deep learning neural nets, generative AI, and the success of transformers like large language models, and the use of the entire corpus of human wisdom, and the increasing brilliance of some of these large language models through innovations such as Q-Star is making us question the very nature of being human. The machine appears to be replicating our very intelligence, our very chain of thoughts, our very aspirations, and our very desires. And yet, large language models are so far away from enabling, if you like, true intelligence, for they're not capable of consciousness, of conscience, of being truly proactive. The issue of what value exchanges should be permissible or what's right and wrong is the space for the subject of AI and data ethics. If we can have the slides, please. Yeah, so myself, I'm a geek. I think that's the best way to put it. I've had various roles. I've been director for artificial intelligence for Capita. I've been director for advanced technologies for Siemens. I've had a few startups. I'm on various parliamentary committees. I've written various books. As I said, I'm on various governments, including advising the Cabinet Office and so on. But my real desire, my real sort of aspiration is in that issue of enabling, if you like, an intelligence that's beyond LLMs. I won't say ASI or AGI for the time being, but I fundamentally believe that LLMs are just so limited. And as a postmodernist, I have a real issue with value judgments. I think standards and legislation and regulation has its place, but values in society, in clans, in nation states change with time. And it's rightly so, because, there is no such thing as truth. There is no such thing as right and wrong. And it's an ever sifting, mercurial sort of construct. I'm one of those people who believes that we cannot really trust governments. And I'm one of those people that believes that we cannot really trust big tech to make the right decisions about, where AI is used, how it's used, and so on. So we are left with this great question as to who can we trust? what are the real problems in defining ethical AI that is time neutral? What does compliance against regulations mean? And that's when I start to differentiate between ethical AI and responsible AI. Responsible AI for me is really using AI that ticks the boxes for the regulation and legislation that's been set for us. The ethical issue is just so difficult. There are many big vendors, including IBM and so on, that sort of say, we deliver ethical AI. I'm one of those people who chooses to disagree with them, because I don't really think we can really define what's right and wrong. And when I talk about AI ethics a little bit later on, you'll see what I mean. The fundamental thing that begins to steer us in terms of the right direction for what AI ethics is to consider the vectors for intelligence. And until recently, anything we did, when I say recently, maybe 30 years ago, everything we did was in the rational, logical, mathematical space. But increasingly, with IoT and with other types of data coming in, with the fact that we can understand the nuances of speech, we can understand the nuances of expression and so on, we are beginning to rationalize those things that were irrational, features of the face, the way somebody's saying something, what they've left out and so on. So we are beginning to head into those other vectors of data. And fundamentally, the whole space about AI ethics, I think, ought to be largely the space of data ethics. Because if you don't feed the algorithm some data, it can't really use that data to make some of those decisions. So everything really, for me, comes back to ethics. There are, of course, issues around algorithms and their explainability and so on, but those pale into insignificance when compared with the issues that surround data. And I wanted to let you all know that any slides that I'm using here, can be made available through CMI. So do contact them if you want the slides. But I've given the vectors of data that are fundamentally crucial in terms of understanding intelligence. There are issues of trust, issues of relevance, issues of return on investment and costs, and issues about strategy. How do we get to, maybe data that's going to be intelligent, rather than having been meta tagged and so on by one engineer and somebody else sort of saying, I don't really agree with that construct of data. So we're trying to get to a place where data is much more meaningful, i.e. data is intelligent. Data is almost like an algorithm. And the way you construct any intelligent system is to look at the real-time data coming in, looking at the static data, historical data, public domain data, and then going through various things such as, what ethical principles you want to embed in it, what legislation you want to bring in, and so on. And then we come on to, if you like, the data ops. What are you going to do with data to make sure that the wrong type of data isn't really fed into your system? Data that maybe encourages discrimination or, some other great problem that we see as society. And then how does it feed into the various algorithms? And of course, algorithms have changed. Traditionally, we would have just used statistical programming. Nowadays, we tend to use, if you like, deep learning neural nets. And where we've headed to now is, if you like, manifold mapping, manifold learning, transfer learning. We've gone into transfer models like, GPT and so on. So if you like, that for me is the real big step up from what we used to be doing, let's say 3, 4, 5 years ago. And the fourth type of AI that we question as to what that's going to look like is where a machine sort of says, I want to be, I need to survive, and so on. So that's a fourth type, and I just put question marks there. And then we go into that aspect where if you have that intelligence, you have that intelligence manifest, such as through motor neurons or something that actually impacts your overall system. How do you end up evolving it, given that the environment that your intelligence system is sitting in is changing? Yeah. So that for me is the thing to create intelligent solution. If I look at AI ethics in big numbers. There's just so much that it's impacting in terms of companies, in terms of society, and so on. And everybody's talking about the kill switch and so on. I'm one of those people who really doesn't believe that we need a kill switch. I think we are so far away from actually getting to a stage which is way beyond LLMs. But look, the statistics are there. Virtually everybody is looking at how to incorporate AI ethics into their development principles, how they end up making sure that the customer is going to be sure that we are doing the right thing with their data, that we've done the right thing with the way we've extracted value, and so on. Then we come on to, if you like, what are the ethical principles? And the ethical principles are really straightforward. You can Google this and so on. It's like, do no harm, do good, respect the human, ensure fairness and equality, and ensure that there is transparency in decisions. And this is really where somebody like me, as a postmodernist, as I say, has real problems, because most of the time, I'm not sure about what doing good means. Of course, society here and now defines that you mustn't create a system that's going to kill a lot of humans and so on. Right. But there are also other bits of doing good which actually inhibit competition or stop the system from evolving into the natural state that it ought to be in. Yeah. So those are really the ethical principles we try to embed in AI systems. And then we, of course, end up embedding, the issues around fairness, bias, transparency, explainability, and so on. The explainability is particularly, of course, interesting, which is, did the algorithm do what I expected it to do? And that then becomes sometimes a very human decision, very legislation-based solution, which is, the risk versus the reward ratio. With is the regulator going to hit me with a big bill if I end up coming up with an insight that's fundamentally going to power my business? So I think there are real issues to do with that. And of course, ultimately, companies like some of the ones that I run are looking at that auditability, which is that once you've gone from the start of data to value realization, can you do an audit and sort of say you did no wrong? The issues with data, they're manifold. It's like, your ethical data practices, GDPR, or things that we are trying to do in England, which is to maybe enable more innovation. After all, we've been stuck, during the pandemic, at relying on Apple and on Google to provide us with, if you like, who might be infected and so on. And we've never really had that sort of big data. So I think, there are obvious issues to be sorted. And I think as a country, we are trying to sort of say, how do we enable some of that data to be used by business to extract those sites that are generally beneficial? At the same time, of course, we have to either loosen the legislation a little bit, or, maybe put some, specific use cases where you can't take the data out of that use case. And then the right things about, the things that are emerging with Web3 and so on, which is the ability of every individual to have right to their data, to monetize their data, to sort of say, I'll give you my data for X dollars or whatever. And then finally, the issues around data to do with security, to stop hackers getting information that will bankrupt you, or maybe, bankrupt companies and so on. So, those are obviously issues we have to consider. The issues about autonomy and control, a machine that's gone rogue, that goes around, doing harm, of course, those are things we need to look into. I used to run a company called Xeno, and we used to think about, shall we allow a fintech to do whatever is necessary to win a trade? And of course, the easy thing, the very human thing is, yes, I wanted to be able to do anything because all I want to do is get rich. But imagine if taking down, a ship or whatever, is the thing that's going to make you win a trade. So obviously, There are things to do with how much autonomy you want to give it, how much you want it to be able to make its own decisions, and how much, if you like, regressively, you want to look at what potential data it can be trained on and what actions it can take in the real world. So those sort of things come under autonomy and control. You can imagine, fly-by-wire aircraft or drones or cars fall into the same category. And then there are obviously social and economic impacts. I'm one of those people who believes that AI has a real potential to make society more equal, because all you need is a computer, and the code is there to be used and for you to do the innovation. But at the other end, there are very few big tech companies that end up controlling much of what we can do when we're using cloud services or data that is in the public domain and so on. So at one end, there is this thing that maybe we can make society more equal, but at the other end, the entire ecosystem is dominated by big tech, which really ends up leveraging the flow of wealth to those companies. So the beneficiaries of the value add are not where the value is being added, but by the companies that enable that thing to be done. So the wealth and the consumer get separated. All the wealth, much of the wealth, is flowing in one direction. So we do really have some real issues to do with how we can try to reduce the impacts on society and on economics and so on. The regulation, of course, we want things to be regulated because we humans tend to change much more slowly, and we want to be in our comfort zone. We want to feel that there is some safety in what comes next. And of course, you can see, the EU AI Act emerge. You can see how many companies, tens of thousands, that are going to be impacted by it, that are going to have to comply. Otherwise, they will face penalties that will either bankrupt them or cause irreparable reputational damage and so on. So there is that aspect about regulation, and then how they're going to evolve as the environment we sit in changes. At the other end, of course, we have this tremendous game about geopolitics, about wanting to be the dominant power and so on. And I think in that arena, there are things that one can imagine that some states, some nefarious players may play that will enable them to get the heads up over those people that are playing more fairly. And of course, when push comes to the shove, the differentiation between the good guys and bad guys just disappears. So there are obvious dangers there, and I'm not sure how one is going to do that given the current state of politics. And then finally, we have future challenges. We've got emerging technologies. I personally am looking at things around, if you like, homology and taxonomy, and ontology is a bandied about word, but it has deep implications. And then, of course, the things that really add value systems, epistemology and axiology. So how does one begin to build that into data to make sure that one has a truly intelligent system? Much of LLMs just do not incorporate much, even some aspects of ontology. So I think there's a lot that's going to emerge. There's a lot that we're going to have to rethink about in terms of how much more intelligent systems can be than a human. And then, of course, the quantum computing and complexity science and things around scale invariance, around the cosmos and so on. So they're going to fundamentally impact what we see to be the purpose of intelligence and so on. The challenges that I see are the engagement of the public. If we don't trust the government, and if we don't trust big tech, who are we going to trust? And I'm personally engaged with a couple of community interest companies which engage academia, which engage various verticals and try to come up with legislation that's going to be reasonably independent of big tech and government. Of course, it'll comply to regulation and it'll contribute to regulation, but nonetheless, there has to be an ecosystem outside, the two big players to enable the public to gain trust. And there is a tremendous amount of research into ethical AI going on, but I hasten to add that that is research, and academia tends to move much more slowly than small and medium enterprises. So there's a lot to be watched for here. As I mentioned at the start of my talk, I set up a company called Xeno AI, where we wanted to build AI assurance as a service. And we're just about to publish this paper in 3 weeks' time, which sort of says what are the steps one needs to take to enable any company to log into the system to sort of say, am I compliant or not compliant? If I'm not compliant, what do I need to do to make sure that I'm using AI responsibly? I think the issue about using AI ethically is something that worries me, because people confuse the two. Yeah. And then finally, there's no system that we're going to be changing that is greenfield. So we have to see how we're going to introduce all these aspects into a system that's live, whether it's to do with education or whether it's to do with defense. How do we bring in these systems, prove that what we're doing with the data is ethical, and yet still allow the people and the processes to operate in a way that seems familiar to people? Yeah. And fundamentally, the issue about AI, responsible AI, is going to be about people, processes, and about technologies, and we just need to be cognizant of connecting to the business needs. So that's about all I have to say. I'm all up for questions.
Tirath, many thanks for taking us through the slides there. That was a very very detailed sort of look at the breadth of issues that need to be considered around AI and ethics. Thank you very much. Just before we come on to questions from the audience, just to let you know, if you're watching live, then do please type your question to the chat. We're going to come to as many of those questions as we possibly can. Tirath, one of the things that really stuck out for me towards the end of your presentation is the idea of sort of regulating the ethics around AI, and you mentioned the way in which often research, legislation, governments move at a slower pace than the innovators. That must be one of the big challenges here, surely.
Yeah, look, it's a controversial thing to say, but we humans are fundamentally flawed. The most splendid and the most awful can exist in the human at the very same time. Mm-hmm. And for somebody like that to be regulating, for somebody who's compromised by financial gain, to be on the regulators, to be on the government, is a point of concern. But at the other end, in terms of doing the work that the regulator expects us to do, those are simple rules. So they're relatively easy to implement. It'll be checked that the data is not in this domain. It doesn't contain somebody's, personally identifiable information and things like that. So those are the easy bits. But I think where we're going to have a real problem is, and to some extent we're encountering this with large language models, where the corpus of human knowledge is moving us into that domain where it's giving us far better answers than many humans would. And yet there's no easy way of checking whether it's right or wrong. Mm-hmm. And yet, if you asked a human and they gave you a worse answer, as long as they had a few letters after their name, you would sort of say, yeah, I trust that. Yeah. So I think that there are real issues to be tackled. And to some extent, these hallucinations and so on that are in large language models at the moment, there are ways of dealing with them. And I know a number of companies that are working with bringing in a number of large language models and trying to sort of say, well, this isn't right. It's a bit like a voting system. 2 or 3 of these models are saying this and that one is saying that. It's simply the data that's been trained on. A bit like a human. What data have you been trained on? If you've been always gone for confirmation bias, and everybody's telling you that this is right and that's wrong. That's just the way the cookie crumbles. So I think we do have real issues there. I feel that complying with legislation and regulation is the easy bit.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Look, we're starting to receive a few questions from the audience, Tirath. So I think we'll turn firstly to Mohammed Jabir's question. Good to have you with us, Mohammed Jabir. He asks, what ethical principles should guide the design and use of AI systems, and how can organisations ensure that their AI practices align with those ethical principles?
Yeah, I think, look, the EU AI Act is reasonably clear. It classifies systems into high risk, acceptable risk, or low risk. So you can go and read it, but I think those that are high risk, of course, need a much greater scrutiny, or one just has to sort of say, do not allow AI there. The ethical principles of doing no harm, doing good, as I say, as a society, we are very clear about what that is for the time being. And I think to implement those, to make sure that the guidelines in any organization sort of say what data you can use, what algorithms you can use, how you make sure that there is explainability, how there's auditability. Those are things that I would just end up doing. And having the procedural detail, it's there. You just need to search it, and it's there mostly. The big issue is how do you plug it into your organizational processes? Because often the problem isn't, if you like, at the end when the result pops out. It is the fact that there are people who don't really understand these things, who end up making decisions that, may lead us the wrong way. So it's people and process issue much more than a technology issue, I believe. That
really stood out to me as a question as you were speaking earlier, Tirath, in terms of great that those big numbers around the investment in AI ethics are there, and you mentioned that most large organizations are significantly investing in AI ethics, which is heartening to hear. But one of the things that really stood out to me is, do you feel that enough of the key decision makers in our, I guess, society, whether they're working in business or government, really have a grasp on these ethical considerations?
I think when it comes to the narrative, they appear to have, if you like, the right credentials. But when it actually comes to some of the bigger systemic challenges that are going to be facing us, which is, one country allows all its data to be used to, for the greater good, and we are very careful about individual privacy and so on. What's going to give? Google and Facebook had their heyday when there was no regulation. They did some amazing things. And if we're going to be constrained by regulation, if you're going to constrain our innovation and the intelligence we can get, that's going to power our society for the future, then are we really doing the right thing? And I think those sort of questions are being asked behind closed doors. But I think, maybe not at the sort of new innovation space where it needs to enable something to power our next wave of innovation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. We've got a great question from Lena. Nice to have you with us, Lena. And Lena asks, do you believe that AI ethics should be included into future ESG frameworks of corporations and SMEs? And perhaps the ISO frameworks around AI ethics could be developed in the future?
Well, yes, there are already many of these things that are in draft formats and so on. And I think sooner or later, we have to start harmonizing a little bit, because how many of them are you going to comply with? Just because you comply with some ISO framework doesn't mean that you necessarily comply with the EU framework or whatever. So I think there has to be a degree of harmonization. But overall, in terms of the ethical principles, they're just a few. Do no harm, do good, that sort of thing. So I think, yes, small enterprises, maybe not very small businesses, because the amount of data, the data sets that they're handling for clients are just so small. But certainly the larger companies that have access to really big data, primarily big tech, I think they ought to be better regulated. what you can get out of a big data set is nothing like what you can get out of a small data set.
Fantastic, thank you. Oludari has joined us today. Thank you for your question, Oludari. They ask, how can AI systems be designed to reflect ethical decision-making processes? Are there any frameworks that you suggest for embedding ethical considerations, for instance, when building an AI assistant that uses a large language model?
Yeah, look, as I said, large language models at the moment, people are only starting to really use them in anger. It was a nice toy to play with until very recently. But the fact that they're being used and the mathematics that's developed around them, which is, if you like, the increasing of the context, so the overall answer is semantically connected. So I think there are a great many issues that one is grappling with. I'm not sure that it has been solved. There are great teams at Google and Microsoft and OpenAI and so on that are looking at these things. There are great principles that they put out. So I would sort of say that if you want to look at what's being done in the LLM space, just go to the OpenAI website and look at their ethical principles about how they are ensuring that AI assistants are adhering to some of those ethical principles. Even now, if you go, and you can try this, if you mention anything that is really, on the fringe, like making a bomb or, killing somebody or whatever, he'll sort of say, sorry, you need to seek help or something. Yeah. So you can see them coming in and sort of saying, I'm not going to answer this because this is leading you the wrong way. But there's some really great work being done as to whether one has workarounds that one can get you to give the answers. Of course, there are workarounds, yeah, and it's those sort of things that need to be closed up and so on. But when you close something up, there's always somebody who's going to find a way of getting the information they want.
Great, thank you. Good advice. Priyanka is currently doing a master's thesis in ethical data governance, and particularly around smart city data platforms. Sounds like an interesting topic. And they wonder if you could tell them just a little bit more about some of the principles that you've shared that might help with that kind of research. I wonder if you've got a quick thought.
Yeah. Look, I think the thing about smart cities and big data offers so many possibilities, and I wrote up a little bit about it some time ago. So, there are many. Take for instance the interaction between cars and lights, traffic lights, and so on. The fact that there's IoT in the car, and the fact that there's IoT in the lights, and so on. You can solve all those problems to do with queuing and so on, dynamically, rather than set rules about times of day and so on. So there are those sort of things. And then I think there are the other aspects, such as pollution and so on. At what stage does a pollution peak, and at what stage do you sort of start routing traffic in a particular direction so that the pollution doesn't get out of control and things like that. I think the possibilities of smart city data, and this has been seen some of the smart city experiments in China, are just enormous. The city becomes like a living entity. It's almost has the ability to see who's done the robbery and stop them at lights. It's a matter of, do you want to go that far in terms of proactivity? If somebody's taking a gun to kill somebody, do you want to alert the police to stop them before the crime's been committed? And how are you going to prove that in the court that they were going to kill this person? Yeah. So there are a huge number of issues around that big data, what can be done in terms of city behavior, in terms of optimizing the city, in terms of making the city safer, cleaner, better. Yeah. So I think there's a lot that can be done. Then the ethical principles, of course, can be embedded in there. And the ethics about whether you let somebody die or not, that's a difficult one, because if a crime hasn't been committed, so lots of ethical issues to consider.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Priyanka. I hope Tirath's thoughts helped with your research. We've got a question from George Roussos. Hi, George. And George asks, is it generally expected that the balancing act of ethical requirements amongst different legislations, acts, etc., will be progressively dealt with by the judicial system and fed back into the legislation? Interesting point.
Yeah, that is an interesting one. And I think it depends on which side of the fence you sit on. I do believe that it's in the interest of all nation states to harmonize in this space, because we live in one world, and somewhere, UN was a good experiment, and you can see where that's led us. And I think this has to be something like that, where every nation state ends up signing to a certain level. And of course, I am one of those people who worries as to what somebody signs up to and what they do behind closed doors. There are always those sort of issues. And I think these things are just of such enormous impact, is of as much impact as having the non-proliferation, if you like, treaty, which is that we will stick with this because otherwise there's a systemic danger to humanity. And until actually people realize that, I think people are just going to be paying lip service. Of course, they will come up with legislation. They will try to sort of say, we are the good boys. But it really needs to be enacted in a way that by the time we get to AGI, that everybody firmly believes in the goodness of having things like this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, a couple more questions before we wrap up, Tirath. You've certainly got people thinking. Olodare has come back with a follow-up question. So they're asking, what are some of the longer-term societal impacts that you foresee with the advancement of AI, and how should we prepare for those changes? That's a big question.
That's a big question. Look, as I say, I think we humans are fundamentally flawed in that we are easily bought. And there is something very noble about the human, in that, the way our brain has the ability to change, it has been surprising. The fact that within a few generations, the brain can actually alter our physiology just by deprecating certain neural structures in the brain and coming up with new ones. So what the human brain is capable of is really quite amazing. The implication of that is that I think as a society, we'll have to be more flexible about what's right and wrong. I think these societal norms that used to take decades and millennia to evolve will need to be evolving much more quickly. At the other end, I think as soon as the human limitations are overcome by, let's say, AGI, the limitations to do with our limited compute, the limitations to do with our limited lifetimes, the physiological limits as to what we can lift and where we can be, and so on. So I do feel that AGI has the ability to take the human to places that we've never gone before. And it's a matter of, do we have the cognitive apparatus? Do we have the ability to come up with new neural structures? Do we have the ability to be virtualized and still realize that we are being virtualized? Do we have that ability to totally disconnect from, Mother Nature and so on? So I think those are the real big advances that are coming. And whether we can deal with them, at one end, yes, I want to sort of say, well, the evolution of life on Earth has shown us that it can evolve to virtually anything. But I think when one is beginning to question the very nature of intelligence, the ability to tell differentiate between things and the ability to optimize, what's the next level of intelligence? Once you begin to understand the cosmos, what more is there? Yeah. So I worry about those sort of bigger questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that's a great place to finish on such a big question. But Tirath, many, many thanks for your time today. I'm sure, like me, the live audience and those watching back later on when they get to it will have had huge value from all that you've taken us through today. And many thanks to everybody that's provided questions for Tirath to get his teeth into today. If you'd like to get involved with the Institute of Consulting, then please do take a look at our website. And in the live chat, you'll find links to find out more about becoming a chartered management consultant. But Tirath, many thanks for today, and I hope everybody's enjoyed today.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Take care.
Don't forget, as a CMI member, you can find the latest management and leadership insights at managers.org.uk. If you're not yet a member, join our community to discover CMI Confidence with on-demand resources, our network of mentors, and industry-leading accreditations.